If you celebrate Christmas, you absolutely cannot celebrate Yule. And if you celebrate Yule, you absolutely cannot celebrate Christmas. It's mindsets like this that cause cultures to die. And it's the very antithesis of what culture is in its spirit. So you and I, right now, we're going to talk about how cultural gatekeeping is in fact the killer of cultures. Grab a drink, grab a seat. You know I've got a story for you. Welcome back, wayward children, to my humble hovel. I am Casa, this is my tavern, and here we talk about myth and lore and tales of yore. But today, most specifically, we are talking about Yule and, of course, Christmas, and how they interlink with one another. Now, I came across this video while perusing the annals of TikTok, and I found myself confronted with a striking dilemma. Do I leave it alone, or do I address the gatekeeping of culture here in the tavern? And well, you can clearly see I have decided to start a discussion with all of you, the denizens of the Black Dragons. So, let us go through it. Should you be allowed to participate in a holiday to which you are not native to? Is Christianity responsible for stealing their traditions entirely from pagan groups? Is Christmas a pagan holiday? Or is Yule an entirely different holiday and they just so happen to fall within the same realms as one another? And this is what we're going to talk about. Well, there's a lot to unpack here, so let's go through it. First, I want to point out that both of the women in this video both make solid points. While I do believe that the first girl is being unnecessarily contrary, there is a lot that needs to be understood about these two topics in order for us to get past this point where we're constantly fighting about who has rights to what and who belongs to what. Because while there is a certain aspect of person to culture, culture itself has some requirements that these mindsets, they kind of eliminate what it is culture is supposed to be. So first, before we get into this, I want to talk about the dictionary definition of culture. And I'll put up a screenshot here while discussing this, but more or less, culture are the things, the physicalities and traditions that are handed down from one generation to another. And a lot of people would like to make it more complex than that, but when you look at the depths of history, this you'll find to be one of the most universal truths about culture, is that it's not always carried on by certain ethnic groups, it's not always carried on by certain families. Sometimes it's a macro, where it's carried on between a plethora of people of different varieties and ethnicities and backgrounds and religions over thousands of years. And sometimes, like in the case of my family, it's a group of a singular set of people who carry down such a unique and sparse set of traditions that they're almost completely unheard of, even in the greater culture from which that culture comes from. And there are quite a few reasons for why this happens. And honestly, the reasons why things like my family's culture being so unique and so unheard of in the wider culture of things like Ireland and Norway, you will see small tidbits of what we participate in as our culture being spread throughout those. But our specific set is so incredibly unique that many would reject that it was a part of any of them. And that very detail is why cultures tend to die. So let's start off with an easy one. Are Christmas and Yule the same holiday? Now, I've made plenty of videos about this. I've got a whole playlist of them up here. And I do often draw parallels between Yule and Christmas, pointing to traditions in Christmas that have been borrowed or taken from Yule. And I do that more in the spirit of combining the holidays and giving us something in common to share, not necessarily to refute or fumigate out different groups of people. So, is Yule and Christmas the same holiday? Well, the short answer is no, they are not. And the long answer is that they never really have been. So, December 25th is commonly referred to as the birthday of Jesus Christ. Now, we all know that December 25th is absolutely not the birth date of the Christ child Jesus of Nazareth. We know that to be a fact. That is not the day that he was born. So why is it that we celebrate that day as the birthday of Jesus Christ? Well, many people will argue that is the date of Saturnalia and that's why they stole it. But to be perfectly honest, that's not entirely accurate, nor is it historically substantiated. Now, Saturnalia is the celebration of the sun god, Saturn, or in some cases he's a sky god. There are many different versions of Saturn, but in general it is a celebration of Saturn. However, it is believed that the god Mithra or Mitra was born on December 25th, and it's widely accepted that that is the birth date of Mithra. So many people will draw the correlation of, oh, Jesus is Mithra, or they just simply overlapped because they were trying to take over the holiday. Historical context here is very important. The cult of Mithra, which took Saturnalia as its primary celebratory holiday, started forming around the year 250, and it was in about the year 330 that that cult really started to gain momentum. Up until that point, it was sort of a small niche cult amongst different Roman groups. Now, around that same time, around 330 to 350 AD after death, we see the rise of the Roman Emperor Constantine. And Constantine was one of the most Christian emperors Rome ever had. He was one of the ones responsible for Rome becoming almost an entirely Christian nation. And during this time period there was a lot of rebellion within the ranks of the Romans because they were constantly back and forth between emperors. So there was a huge split in the culture, and those cultures created subcultures. And a lot of the Roman soldiers were really big on the celebratory aspect of the cult of Mithra, because there was a lot of drinking, there was a lot of partying, there was a lot of use of illicit substances like hallucinogenic mushrooms. Saturnalia was a wild party, and Constantine was an emperor of order. He liked for things to be well fit, well organized, and well put together. So when many Roman soldiers started taking on the cult of Mithra and celebrating the more pagan aspect of Saturnalia, Constantine said, no, we're not going to do that because that is antithetical to how I want to run my empire. Now, around this time, there was a lot of debate as to when the birth of Jesus Christ was. Some said it was January 7th or January 9th. Some put it as far out as March 18th or 19th. And of course, there were some who put it around the time of December 24th or 25th because of the correlation to Mithra. Now, Constantine decided, and he made it rule of law, that Jesus Christ's birthday was not on December 25th, but it would be recognized and celebrated on the 25th of December, and it was to battle his soldiers constantly following through with these debaucherous celebrations that caused an imbalance in his rule. So while we could argue that that had religious motivations, the fact are it was more military and political motivations. And while it can seem like that was a massive thievery from the cult of Mithra, well, the fact of the matter is the cult of Mithra only has about 30 years on the rise of Christianity in the Roman Empire. So they were kind of developing sort of alongside each other. And yes, the cult of Mithra does have more time there, but when you talk about it from a developmental and historical standpoint, 30 years is not a lot of time. So it's not like this was generations of celebrations and tradition that were robbed from the cult of Mithril, the Mithril Pagans. No, it was about 100 years or so of this time set, and anybody who studies history or anything of the like will tell you 100 years in regards to these sort of traditions, really, it's not a lot. And later on, with different popes and so on within the Catholic Church, you would see a lot of reinforcement of that birthday of Jesus Christ. So, what about Yule? Is it the same celebration as Yule? Did they steal these sort of things from Yule? Well, no, and there was a lot of resistance amongst the Christians and Catholics all the way up until the year about 700 and 800 as to celebrating Jesus' birthday on the 25th of December because of the correlation to the cult of Mithra. And it actually wasn't until generations later, with the celebration of Yule, that they actually encountered the same problem. Celtic and Nordic pagans such as the Vikings, the Celts and the Picts and all of these large militant groups that were starting to mesh and meld into the general culture had the same sort of debaucherous celebrations. Yule amongst the Danes and the Norsemen, the Northmen, was a very accelerated celebration. There was a lot of drinking, there was a lot of partying, and amongst some Swedish kings there was even a lot of sacrifice that went on. And of course the Christian kings, both amongst the Danes, and keep in mind that one of the biggest reasons why Christianity ended up taking over paganism in Europe was because of Viking kings, and I have a whole video about that here. But the Viking kings were one of the primary reasons why Christianity ended up taking over paganism, and it was because they realized that under a singular god they would have more power over their people. There'd be more unity amongst their people than allowing them to worship this plethoric sort of polytheistic set of gods. So they maintained the culture of the worship of ancestors, but then they placed the Christian gods, Christian principles above all else, and that is what ended up leading to these things. Now, Yule, the Feast of Yule, typically ends on the 23rd, and I have mentioned in videos before that a lot of Christian kings and Christian leaders started placing more emphasis on that celebration, even though they had priorly resisted it, because it was an easy way, one, for them to indoctrinate midway pagans, and two, a way for them to demonize the more aggressive pagan Danish and Norse groups that celebrated very heavily and with a lot of, frankly, with a lot of collateral damage for these sorts of celebrations. So there ended up being a large emphasis on these celebrations taking place around the same time as Yule. And of course, with the integration of cultures, as I said, the Danish and Norse kings, who really were responsible for Christianity taking over Western Europe, those kings obviously were going to integrate a lot of their own traditions in. And this is where we come to the point of this video. Culture is a handing down of traditions and physicalities from one generation to the next. Christianity is a Middle Eastern religion. It comes from places like Israel, Jerusalem, Nazareth, Bethlehem. Those were the areas where it came from, and as invaders from that area came down into Eastern and Western Europe, as they invaded in, and whether it was for war or whether they were coming in for trade, that religion ended up finding its way into Europe and ended up becoming the primary principal staple religion of that area over a course of several hundred years. And that is what I mean by culture transcending. Culture is a macro when it comes to certain things, and it ends up being handed down over a course of many generations. And it may not have originally belonged to them, but culture doesn't necessarily belong to anyone, because culture as it is belongs to whoever currently holds the torch, whoever is carrying it on in perpetuity and respect. Our family has very strict rules about not keeping people out of our culture, but ensuring anyone who is going to carry it properly, be a teacher, ensuring that they respect it before they carry on and start taking it amongst other people, to ensure that it is presented in all of its greatness, to preserve what it is we have worked so long and hard to maintain. So when you get things like this, where we battle about whose culture is greater or whose culture belongs to who, we end up with this sort of Spartanesque damnation to our future, You have so many cultures around the world that remained very, very closed. And because of that, they started to die off and even sometimes lose their own foundations. Like in the case of the Spartans and the Athenians, or whether we go into certain Asian groups that have disappeared over time, certain African groups that disappeared over time. A lot of this, and obviously the gatekeeping of culture isn't the only reason why culture disappears, but you'll find if you go back and you look at every culture that has faded out over time, that's usually at least one of the foundationary things that led to the cultures dying out. The most important thing about culture is that it is passed on, regardless of who carries it, as long as it's carried on with respect. So while we should safeguard the respect of culture, we should never keep people from enjoying it. And obviously this is just mine and my family's opinion. This is how we treat our culture, and it's why our culture has managed to survive for well over 10,000 years. But I think that it's very important that we recognize that this sort of discussion and argument when it comes to culture and the things that we are passing down and handing to each other, that we have a very serious conversation about whether or not that is what is most beneficial to, one, keeping the culture alive, and two, respecting what so many people worked so hard to pass down to us. Because even as brutal of a man as my grandfather is, I've never seen him turn someone away from a festival. I've seen him tie drunks up and toss them on a pile, but I've never seen him turn someone away from a festival. And I personally, and all who are here in the tavern, believe that the most beautiful thing about traditions and culture is the fact that we get to share them again and again and again, and we continually get to grow in them with each other. And that is the true and most beautiful aspect. And one might say, I would say, that that is the true essence of what culture is. Thank you so much for joining me, my friends. I hope you have been well in this new year, and I hope you will join me the next time that we turn the page. Stay bloodthirsty, my friends, and remember, all hail the black dragons.